What if the most important battle in the Iran conflict is not happening over Tehran at all? What if the explosions lighting up the capital are only the visible echo of a much larger fight, one taking place hundreds of miles away? Across coastlines, islands, command centers, missile batteries, and the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz. Because when Iranian air defenses suddenly activate over Tehran, the natural assumption is simple. The capital is under attack. But that may be the wrong question. The more important question is this: what happened somewhere else that made Tehran believe the threat was coming next? The hero of this story is not a fighter jet. It is not a missile. It is not even the city of Tehran. It is the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway that looks almost insignificant on a map, yet sits at the center of one of the world's most dangerous strategic calculations. On a satellite image, it appears almost fragile, a thin passage of blue water. But beneath that surface is a system connecting military power, global energy, commercial shipping, and political survival. And that is where the contradiction begins. Iran can threaten the Strait of Hormuz, but the moment it tries to control the strait, it also exposes the very infrastructure that gives it that power. That is why the latest strike campaign matters. According to U.S. Central Command, the operation targeted Iranian command centers, air-defense positions, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities. At first glance, that sounds like another list of military targets. But look at the pattern. Command centers control decisions. Air defenses protect the sky. Missiles and drones provide offensive power. Coastal surveillance provides the eyes watching the water. And Tehran loses a capability. And something much more important happens. And that is the first thing most people miss. Modern air warfare is not simply about destroying weapons. It is about destroying the network that allows weapons to work together. Now move south on the map. The camera leaves Tehran behind and follows the Iranian coastline toward Bandar Abbas. This is where the geography changes the story. Bandar Abbas sits near the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz, close to one of the world's most strategically sensitive maritime choke points. Nearby islands provide Iran with positions from which it can monitor and potentially threaten shipping. Tehran has treated these locations as forward positions, places where coastal missiles, surveillance systems, and naval forces can influence what happens inside the strait. But here's the problem. A military position that gives you control over a choke point also becomes a fixed target. The closer your weapons are to the waterway, the easier it becomes for an opponent to identify what must be neutralized. That creates a strange paradox. The same geography that gives Iran leverage also concentrates its vulnerabilities. And once the strikes begin, that vulnerability becomes visible. The operation reportedly expanded across multiple locations: coastal facilities, military installations, surveillance sites, and targets farther inland. The exact details of individual strikes remain difficult to verify independently, and wartime claims must be treated carefully. But the broader pattern is strategically important. The campaign appears designed not simply to punish Iran. It appears designed to reduce Iran's ability to see. That distinction changes everything. Imagine the battlefield from inside an Iranian command center. A radar screen is active. Operators are watching the sky. Reports are arriving from the coast. Missile units are waiting for orders. Naval forces need information about shipping. Aircraft and unmanned systems are trying to determine what is real and what is deception. The danger is no longer just the incoming weapon. The danger is uncertainty. Where is the next strike coming from? Which communications network can still be trusted? A military can survive losing individual weapons. It becomes much harder to fight when it can no longer confidently understand the battlefield. That is why air defense is more than a collection of missiles. It is a nervous system. And modern warfare increasingly begins by attacking the nervous system. But now the contradiction deepens. If the United States and its partners are trying to weaken Iran's ability to control the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has an obvious response. It can retaliate. Iranian claims described attacks against American military infrastructure in countries including Kuwait and Jordan. But the reports immediately collided with another reality. The governments on the receiving end reported interceptions. Kuwait said its forces intercepted incoming cruise missiles and drones. Jordan unreported missile interceptions. Other claims of destroyed bases or damaged military systems remained disputed or lacked independent confirmation. And this creates a second battlefield, not in the sky, in the information space. Because every modern military campaign now has two versions of reality. There is what happened physically, and there is what each side wants its population and the world to believe happened. That distinction matters. A missile intercepted over a military base is one event. A government claiming the base was destroyed is another. The first changes the battlefield. The second changes perception. And perception can influence escalation just as quickly as a weapon. But here's the problem. Information warfare cannot replace military capability forever. At some point, the physical battlefield begins to expose the difference between a claim and a capability. And that is where the Strait of Hormuz becomes even more important. Because the conflict is no longer limited to aircraft and missiles. It is moving toward commercial shipping. Imagine an anchor approaching Iran's most important oil-export infrastructure. The crew knows the waterway is contested. The ship receives warnings. The route changes. And, suddenly the entire global energy market is watching one vessel. That is the hidden power of the strait. A military does not need to sink every ship to create economic pressure. It only needs to make shipping uncertain. That uncertainty can increase insurance costs, delay cargo, redirect vessels, raise oil prices, and force governments thousands of miles away to reconsider their policies. The weapon is not always the missile. Sometimes the weapon is the possibility that the missile might be used. And now we arrive at the first major revelation. The battle for the Strait of Hormuz is not really about controlling a stretch of water. It is about controlling the decisions made by everyone who depends on that water. Ship captains, insurance companies, military commanders, national governments, and eventually. That is why the geography matters so much. A narrow waterway becomes a global pressure point. But the same strategy creates another vulnerability. If Iran threatens shipping, it invites military pressure against the infrastructure supporting that threat. If the United States enforces maritime restrictions, it risks escalating the conflict into a broader confrontation over freedom of navigation and international law. And if either side crosses the wrong line, the economic consequences can spread far beyond the battlefield. This is where military power meets energy, and energy meets geopolitics. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply a military objective. It is a global economic artery, which means every strike around it carries a second question. Not just, but what decision did that destruction force someone else to make? And that is the question that leads into the deeper war. Because everyone is watching the missiles. Everyone is watching the explosions. Everyone is watching the air defenses over Tehran. But the real battlefield may be somewhere much harder to see. It may be the invisible system connecting military command, information, logistics, and political endurance. And, if that is true, then the most important question is no longer whether Iran can launch another missile. The question is whether Iran can continue making coordinated decisions while the system behind those decisions is being systematically pressured. Because once a military loses the ability to see clearly, communicate reliably, and coordinate its response, firepower begins to matter less, and the Strait of Hormuz becomes more than a choke point. It becomes the center of a much larger strategic contest. A contest over who can force the other side to make the next decision. And that is where the visible war ends. Because beneath the missiles and the explosions, another war is already underway. A war over uncertainty. A war over systems. And a war over how long each side can keep functioning under pressure. Everyone thinks this battle is about missiles, aircraft. But the real battle is about decision-making under uncertainty. That is the transformation. The entire conflict looks different. The fighter aircraft is no longer just a platform. The missile is no longer just an explosive. It is a message. The radar is no longer just a defensive system. It is a source of information. And the Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a piece of geography. It is a lever that can influence decisions far beyond the battlefield. This is the invisible battlefield. And it explains why the opening strikes matter. A modern strike package does not simply fly toward a target and drop bombs. The attacker has to understand the battle space. Where are the radars? Which command centers are communicating? Where are the missile launchers? Electronic warfare can interfere with the enemy's picture. Suppression missions can attack or neutralize air-minus defense systems. Precision weapons can strike specific infrastructure. Stand-off weapons can attack from outside the most dangerous threat zones. The objective is not merely destruction. It is to create a temporary environment in which the enemy's decision cycle becomes slower than yours. That is the strategic advantage. One side sees first, decides first, and forces the other side to react. But this creates a new contradiction. The more sophisticated the attacking system becomes, the more expensive the campaign becomes. Every aircraft requires maintenance. Every missile costs money. Every tanker requires protection. Every forward base requires air defense. And every night of sustained operations consumes resources. This is where economics enters the battlefield. A military campaign can win individual engagements and still face a strategic problem if the cost of maintaining pressure becomes unsustainable. The United States has enormous military capacity. But capacity is not infinite. And Tehran knows this. That is why asymmetric warfare remains so important. Iran does not necessarily need to defeat American forces in a conventional battle. It may only need to create enough uncertainty, enough disruption, and enough political pressure to make the cost of continuing the campaign rise. This is the logic behind the Strait of Hormuz. The goal is not necessarily to sink every tanker. The goal may be to make every tanker owner ask whether the next voyage is worth the risk. That question travels quickly, from the bridge of a ship, to an insurance office, to an oil exchange, to a government ministry, and eventually to a national leader deciding whether to continue the war. And the physical battlefield is feeding back into the invisible one. That is why energy matters. A disruption in the strait can influence global oil prices. Higher prices can increase inflation. Inflation can create political pressure. Political pressure can influence military policy. Military policy can change the scale of the conflict. A missile fired near the Gulf can therefore create consequences thousands of miles away without ever hitting a major city. The battlefield is connected. But there is another layer. Industrial capacity. The ability to replace lost drones. The ability to repair damaged radar systems. The ability to replenish interceptors. The ability to maintain aircraft. The ability to keep ships moving. War is not only fought by the weapons already deployed. And this creates another strategic contradiction. A country can possess sophisticated weapons and still become vulnerable if its supporting system is damaged faster than it can recover. A destroyed missile launcher is a tactical loss. A damaged command network is a strategic problem. A disrupted supply chain is a campaign problem, and a damaged industrial base can become a war problem. The question is therefore not simply, who has better weapons? It is who can keep generating military power after the first wave of destruction? That is a much harder question, and it leads directly back to the geography of Iran. The country is enormous. Its coastline is long. Its military infrastructure is dispersed. Its underground facilities are difficult to reach. This gives Iran strategic depth. But strategic depth creates another challenge. The deeper the military system becomes, the more infrastructure it needs to sustain itself. Electricity, communications, transportation, specialized equipment. A bunker can hide a weapon, but it cannot eliminate the need for the people and systems supporting that weapon. That is why hardened facilities are so important, and why facilities such as the underground complex, often referred to as Pekosk Mountain, have become symbols of the next phase of the conflict. The issue is not simply whether a bunker can survive a bomb. The deeper question is what the bunker represents. It represents the attempt to move military capability beyond the reach of conventional attack. And that creates a technological race. Attackers develop deeper mine-penetrating weapons. Defenders dig deeper. Attackers improve intelligence. Defenders build deception. Attackers target entrances and support systems. Defenders disperse infrastructure. Every advantage creates a new vulnerability. That may be the most important lesson of this entire conflict. Technology does not eliminate the battlefield. It moves the battlefield somewhere else. If a weapon cannot be destroyed directly, if the logistics are protected, the communications may become the target. If communications are protected, the decision makers may become isolated. The war keeps moving, and that is why the Strait of Hormuz remains central, because it connects the physical war to the political war. Iran can threaten maritime commerce. The United States can attempt to enforce freedom of navigation. Oil markets can react. Governments can calculate. The question is no longer who can fire the most missiles. The question is who can sustain the most uncertainty without making a catastrophic decision. That is the real contest. And it explains why information warfare is so important. A government that claims victory may be trying to preserve a mystic morale. A military that emphasizes interceptions may be trying to demonstrate deterrence. A commander who remains silent may be protecting operational security. A satellite image may reveal damage that official statements deny. A commercial shipping tracker may tell a different story from a political speech. The modern battlefield is therefore a puzzle assembled from incomplete pieces, and the side that can build the clearest picture gains an advantage. Not certainty. Because uncertainty never disappears. It simply becomes manageable for one side and overwhelming for the other. This is also why the conflict matters globally. The same logic applies to the Red Sea, to the Black Sea, to Taiwan, to any future conflict where a narrow geographic corridor connects military power to global commerce. The lesson is uncomfortable. A country does not need to defeat a superpower directly to create global consequences. It may only need to threaten a system the superpower cannot afford to ignore. And the superpower faces the opposite problem. It may possess overwhelming military power, but using that power can create new economic, legal, and political risks. Every strike can solve one problem while creating another. Every successful operation can force the enemy to adapt. Every new capability can produce a new countermeasure. That is why modern war rarely ends with one decisive weapon. It becomes a competition between systems. Sensors against deception. Missiles against interceptors. Factories against attrition. Economies against sanctions. Political endurance against military pressure. And time against everyone. So the question is no longer, who controls the Strait of Hormuz tonight? Who can keep the entire system functioning when the battlefield expands beyond missiles and aircraft into energy markets, logistics networks, and political decision-making? Because that is the battlefield most people never see. And perhaps the most dangerous possibility is this. The next major turning point may not come when one side destroys a major target. It may come when one side decides that the cost of continuing has finally become greater than the cost of stopping. That decision could be made in a command center, in a political office, on the bridge of a tanker, or inside a bunker beneath a mountain. And once that decision is made, the entire strategic equation changes. The question is no longer who has the strongest weapon. The real question is who can survive a battlefield where every advantage creates a new vulnerability. So let me ask you, do you believe future wars will be won by superior weapons or by the side with the stronger system of intelligence, logistics, economics, and political endurance?